Thank you very much indeed for the invitation, and I do regret that I wasn't here from the start and I can't be here for the whole day. I'm afraid I'm a football widow on Saturdays because my partner is a football referee, so both of my kids are outside. I suppose they might have a little baby friend now as well to play with. But yes, I'm sorry about missing all of your remarks at the start. I'm pleased that I caught quite a number of them. I understand I've been billed as giving a view from Europe, but it's a view that's one step in Europe really through my membership of the European Parliament, but also of course one step here in the UK because I do live here, I campaigned here for the referendum, my family lives here. And also I suppose a little bit of a view from my academic background as well, and particularly drawing some of the parallels with some areas that I've studied in the past where we've seen what I feel ultimately is a bit of a breakdown in empathy, and really that would be the theme of my talk has occurred. Particularly I used to work on the Western Balkans, and I think we can learn, sadly, from some previous experience of some of the breakdowns of responsibility that we might be seeing at the moment. I'm going to try and divide my talk into a section first on the analysis of where we are, and then, yes, trying to think about steps forward, particularly for politicians like me. And I should put my cards on the table. You know, I'm a Labour MEP, so I am talking from a socialist position, but I agree with a lot of what Lord Patten said as well. I think there's a lot of commonality across those in the centre ground, really, of politics at the moment, and those working in civil society as well. I would agree with Lord Patten, first of all, when we look at the untruths that have been around, that of course the referendum campaign in particular in the UK wasn't a great example of political discourse, you know, quite the opposite. I won't rehearse the various different facts that were stated that have since been proved to be untrue. I suppose the only thing I would underline now is that we can't think those problems are over, because actually many people now are of the view that we can quite easily chart a way out of the situation that we're in, that ultimately, for example, saying we can't have access to the single market and freedom of movement at the same time is in some way defeatist, that this is just a fallacious view, that it's being made up as part of that elite conspiracy that so many politicians are assumed to be part of. And that all the administrative problems that exist at the moment around pulling out of the EU will just almost kind of magically resolve themselves. And I think it's quite interesting for me looking at this situation and wondering why people could think that this all would be achievable. And I was talking to a friend of mine, it's interesting, of course, given Lord Patten's experience, a friend of mine whose mother had to evacuate from Hong Kong after, during the Second World War. Somebody who'd had that experience of a state completely breaking down, of kind of experiencing how radically contingent society as we know it can be. And of course she was someone who was saying, I'm worried about the situation. It's not necessarily going to be all right on the night. And I think all of us, certainly my generation, we're so used to in Britain things being all right on the night, somebody sorting things out for us. You think about recent experiences where there have been problems. I could think about, for example, the flooding in Hull, or, that kind of thing, where there was a kind of breakdown of order, it was a breakdown of the state, didn't work properly. But really we haven't experienced that for a prolonged period of time. So there's always a view, for the last 50 or 60 years, I think, in Britain, that bureaucracy somehow, for as much as people might hate it, it will sort our problems out for us. But potentially, of course, it's not going to sort problems out in a very workable way when it comes to extricating ourselves from the EU, and certainly not in the way that many people in the Leave campaign suggested it would do. I wouldn't put everyone in the Leave campaign in that bracket, because I think a lot of them were more thoughtful. But some people were saying, you can have your cake and eat it, it will be delivered and it will all be fine, when really it's not all going to be fine. And then I think we can think about, well, how were those untruths delivered? Who was delivering the kind of untruths? We've talked a lot about the tabloid press already, so I don't want to go over that. But I think also the kind of position of charismatic individuals is something that we can see right across Europe, obviously in the US. We've already touched on Donald Trump's election. But I do think, talking to my colleagues in the European Parliament, that we're seeing similar developments in many different countries. So actually, is it that different? Some of what a politician, and I know a lot of people support him and respect him, but a politician like Nigel Farage was saying, is it that different? Some of what he was saying compared to, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary? Not necessarily that different. Some of his comments, not necessarily that different from some of what Marine Le Pen was saying, very forceful personalities. And equally on the left, you could say, was it necessarily that different from some of what leaders in Venezuela have said at different points? For all that I support some of what went on in that country, still the way that the narrative was delivered was very, very personalised. In a way that we haven't been used to for many decades, generally, at least in Britain. And I think that kind of approach to delivering politics, through charismatic individuals, it does lend itself particularly to social media. We've already talked a little bit about it, but I kind of agree with the analysis that was presented, really, of the dynamic of the campaign in the US, that I felt that the Hillary Clinton campaign, they had all the facts to hand. They could list them all. Sometimes their speeches were almost like a list of facts, trying to eliminate what Trump was saying. But he always would say something attention-grabbing in every appearance that he made that would then get amplified time and time again through social media, and always be one sentence worth that would then be promoted. And it almost had to be shocking in order for it to spread. So I think that we have got a different dynamic of communication that's been occurring, and all of that has meant, I think, that it's been easier and easier for people to stay in their comfort zone, to have their prejudices really confirmed, whether they're the prejudices of the liberal left, which are probably mine, or the privileges of the not so liberal right. The prejudices, they're being confirmed. This isn't something, of course, that's new. And of course, as the people who've created this conference know, the phrase truthiness started being used back in 2005, by an American comedian commenting about how truthiness is the idea of truth that we want to exist. And he then said, "Oh, post-truth is a terrible rip-off of my idea of truthiness." This has been happening for a long time. Why ultimately has it been happening? Well, I suppose I'm a bit of an old Marxist at heart, so I always naturally grab at structural explanations. I know they're not everything, and I certainly don't think they're everything when it comes to how we plan for the future to try and get over this. But there are, I think, some structural explanations for why we're here. I suppose the immediate left response to the referendum result was, well, these are all people who've lost out from globalisation. That's why people rejected the European Union. They've lost from globalisation, and this is their kind of howl of pain, I suppose. There's perhaps something to that, but because people's living standards haven't been improving at the same rate, over certainly the last 5, 10, 15 years. It's the first time that people are likely to have stagnating living standards compared to their parents. So I think that is something new that's happening. And certainly people aren't seeing an advancement in their relative position compared to before. There isn't as much social mobility as there used to be previously. So I'm sure that is impacting on people's assessment of their well-being, and they're wanting to find an outlet for that feeling of dispossession. And I think certainly books like The Spirit Level explain why that might be happening from a psychological point of view. But I think we also do have to, and I know this is something that this institute has looked at a lot, and in general, religious groups have looked at a lot. We do need to look at the breakdown in collective institutions and the lack of trust in those institutions across the board. And that has been a pan-European problem. It's something that's happened everywhere. And obviously, as a socialist politician, I'm particularly concerned about what's happened in relation to my party, but also in relation to the trade union movement and economically integrative institutions. So what can we do about all of this? Well, I really think the banner for a lot of the response has to be, and it sounds very woolly, but it has to be to try and build empathy. It has to be. I think it has to be to try and put ourselves in other people's shoes and understand why they're in this position. Why are these factoids or untruths being repeated? Why aren't people challenging them? And that's why I suppose, first of all, I'm not very happy with the so-called myth-busting approach to certainly discussion around the EU. I mean, a lot of my colleagues were saying, well, we need to just produce lists, myth-busting lists that just say the EU hasn't banned bendy bananas, the EU hasn't done this, it hasn't done that, it hasn't done the next thing. But first of all, it can, as was mentioned, actually reinforce people's idea that, where there's smoke, there must be some fire. Why are you talking about this? But secondly, I think, particularly to people who are in a relatively powerless situation, it comes across as incredibly patronising. It just sounds like you're saying, well, you're wrong and we're right, so just read this and then you'll realise that you're wrong. And I don't really think that works. I think when people have got real concerns, even if some of the reasons for those concerns might be different to their immediate view, we should take on board those concerns. And, here I think my own party has sometimes been part of the problem, I'll be honest. I don't think that Tony Blair's approach sometimes was right when he said, people, they've been left behind by globalisation and we need to help them to be part of that globalisation. We should have talked more about shaping globalisation, I think, to start off with, about thinking, why are people being left behind? And similarly, when Lord Mandelson, somebody who I respect, otherwise and many other things, but when he said we can be profoundly relaxed about inequality, well, should we have said that actually? Because a lot of people aren't relaxed about that. A lot of people do resent the fact that they're working very hard, and yet others seem to have infinitely more resource than them almost. And I think that's why people who felt powerless, they felt they could take back control through the referendum, and some of them feel they still have control. And I'm pleased if they feel empowered, but I don't feel, of course, it is real control, because as Lord Patton said, it's actually giving us less control over many, many issues, because we're cutting ourselves off now from other countries. What else must we resist doing? Well, again, I would agree with much of what Lord Patton said, and I think that we almost need to take our gloves off a little bit on some of this. I think we have to stop, and I'm sorry to use this word, but I think we have to stop collaborating with some of what's happening at the moment. First of all, in terms of some of the scapegoating of migrants that's occurring, those of us who are in positions of power we have a responsibility to challenge untruths, and we have to do that. I've found particularly around issues of benefits and welfare tourism, and I suppose it's partly shaped by my previous experience, because I used to chair a debt and welfare advice centre on Rose Hill, where I live, at a housing estate here in Oxford. I knew that much of the debate around this was very, very badly informed. I knew that much of what was being repeated was wrong. And I wrote to the Press Complaints Commission, as was, to challenge what was being written in newspapers. I challenged my political opponents and political friends when they repeated untruths. And I find myself continually doing that, because I think otherwise is to collaborate with those untruths. And that's got to apply at the policy level as well. I often hear the claim made around some of these issues that we have to go part of the way along the road of accepting untruths in order to shut them down. I don't know if other people have heard this narrative. So, I heard it around immigration issues, where people were saying, well, if Labour doesn't have a tough policy on migration, then the issue will just keep going. It will get bigger and bigger and bigger. By having a policy, we'll shut it down. Same around, people were saying around welfare tourism. And unless Labour has a strong policy on this, it will just, there'll be more and more and more of a conflagration around this issue. If we have a clear policy, it'll shut it down. I think what most progressive people like myself are now realising is, actually, when you develop a policy that takes on board untruths, you put fuel on the flames, you don't put the flames out. And it's taken too long, I think, for that message to be accepted. But people now need to realise that it's so important. And the very last quote that the Chancellor pronounced, I think, was just spot on in that regard. That unless we challenge those untruths, then we're complicit with them, and particularly if we base policy on them, we're very, very complicit with them. Instead, I think we do need to have a different style of politics. Is it one which adopts that same approach of trying to personalise things. You know, if we've got these charismatic individuals pronouncing untruths, maybe one way to fight against them is to ourselves have charismatic individuals promoting our point of view. I don't think that's a sustainable answer. I think any politics that's based around individuals is ultimately fragile. It's obviously not inclusive. We could have problems with it ideologically, but individuals are human. We're all flawed, and eventually the train will come off the buffers because we all have problems. And at the same time, though, I think we do need to recognise that sadly first impressions do matter of individuals who want to be political leaders as well as of everybody else. And I think that's something, you know, that I have to say myself as a Labour politician, I have to accept that people have probably made their minds up already about my current leader, if they like him or they don't. And that's just something that we have to bear in mind. So I don't think it's about just trying to find the right person to deliver the message. It's about a more engaged politics. It's about one which I think, first of all, has a clearer language that doesn't come across as giving an academic lecture on different subjects, that uses the same phrases over and over again to get a message across. I mean, I keep saying to my own party, when we talk about migration, you know, we have a whole slew of different policies around this, which personally I agree with, you know, things about having a migration impact fund, about better policies on housing, about, you know, stopping bad competition at the bottom of the labour market. I'm sure those kind of policies, you know, shared by Liberal Democrats, by Progressive Conservatives, many, many others as well. But their whole list, their shopping list, they're difficult for people to grab onto. If we instead say, we will stop undercutting, and we keep using that phrase time and time and time again, then just maybe people might start to remember that. You know, if they're just listening to the radio when they're making their kids' breakfast, when they're rushing to work, you know, that might finally get through, whereas a long speech is not going to get through. But also, that message has got to be delivered locally. And I think the local really is the solution to a lot of this. It's so important. If you look at what's happened here in Oxford, or for example in Slough, compared to in other cities in the southeast, we haven't had a problem with the extreme right. We haven't really had a problem, sorry, this is terribly normative, whoops, I've got to be careful here. We haven't had incursions from parties that I don't particularly like so much. And I think part of that is because the mainstream parties have been very, very engaged. You know, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the Labour Party, they've been on the doorstep constantly talking to people, constantly. You know, every weekend, every week, they're out there. And that means that those political parties are humanised. So they're not so cut off from ordinary people. And I think that produces trust. And ultimately, that underlies a lot of what's needed here. I mean, just related, I suppose, to what Lord Patten was saying around expenses. You know, I know that my neighbours will know what I've been up to. Okay, they will know. I want them to know what I've been up to. But if ever I'm doing, you know, if ever I'm offered something and I'm not sure about it, I think, well, you know, what would Hayley think, who's my next door neighbour? What would she think about what I'm about to do? Would she think it's cool or not? And if she'd think it's a bit iffy, then I'm not going to do it. And I've both got the genuine fear of people thinking about that, but I always try and have that internalised, that neighbour test. And to be honest, I think enough politicians haven't had that kind of neighbour test, really. But we also need to, I suppose, think about spaces, you know, not just for politicians having empathy, I suppose, with their electorate and the other way round, but also building empathy across our communities. And, you know, particularly on the left, kind of, I suppose, building communities, those kind of issues, they've not really achieved a lot of attention. You know, I'll be honest, within the Labour Party, you know, we like talking about economic issues, we like talking about public services, how we can improve those. We don't really talk about where the new playgrounds are going to go. Don't really talk about how we're going to support the new community festivals. We don't talk about how we're going to make sure that people from different backgrounds come together. We don't talk enough about how we're going to make sure schools have mixed intakes. You know, we don't really think a lot about those issues. We've not thought about them enough. but I think they're so important. They build an identity that isn't a nationalist identity, it's a civic identity. And there are places in Europe that have done this, I think, amazingly. I mean, a city like Vienna, I know they had a very, very difficult election recently, but they've taken in more refugees than any other city, I believe, proportionately across Europe. And yes, they did have a threat from the extreme right at the last election, but until then, they'd had continuous centre-left control in that city, constantly building more and more housing, social housing for migrants in that city, as part of a huge cultural programme that genuinely does involve people from all backgrounds, and an attempt to humanise public services as well. So, everybody in Vienna, they know who their local bin man is, right? They know who their local public servants are. There are pictures of them everywhere. They've got nicknames, there are kind of jokes written about them everywhere. There are even little kind of jingles for them, I mean, they've humanised things and they bring people together. And we need to talk a lot more about that as politicians, I think, into the future. So that's my attempt from a not very erudite background, I suppose, to summarise how I think really part of the solution to all of this is to try and build empathy across our communities, and for politicians to be a lot more empathetic towards the people they try and represent as well.